I need you to grab your copy of the scriptures, and I'm going to tell you a story this morning. A Bible story. Story time with Pastor Judson. It's a beautiful day in the neighborhood. Wow, that got off track really fast. Sorry. Good things we can cut that out, right, Connor? We're going to cut that. It's not going on YouTube. Good. Yeah. Now we can start the YouTube video. Greetings to all those who are watching. Welcome to Bible Baptist Church this morning. I have a message, a story I want to share with you this morning. It's right out of the scriptures, but it's a story some of you are familiar with. Some of you might not be familiar with. Some of you, it's an old story. Some of you, this is a story you're going to be like, wait, what? This is really in the Bible. There's some interesting names, some interesting characters, and I actually put together a little slideshow for you this morning to make this a little bit easier to follow and understand. But it's a very important story that needs to be told and retold, and sometimes in the retelling of a story, you see and hear things that you might not have seen and heard before. So even if it's a story you're familiar with, I'm hoping you pick out something here this morning and learn something and see a way we can apply this to our lives. It's the story of Esther. Her story is recorded in the book of the Bible called Esther, guys. Esther's story is recorded in the book of Esther. I'm going to share Esther's story with you this morning. I'm going to be reading it out of the ESV translation. Sometimes I will switch it up. Sometimes I'll use the NIV, the King James Version, the Amplified Version, and there's even a verse out of the Living Translation, just because I like the way it's phrased. But we do this because we want to be familiar with the story, and I want you to be familiar with the story. It's a very interesting historical account. I'm going to read it, and you're more than welcome to follow along in your copy of the scriptures, or if you'd like, you can look at the pictures that I'm going to put together for you, just to make it a little easier to follow these characters. The story goes like this. In the book of Esther, chapter 1. In the days of Ahasuerus, the Ahasuerus who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces, in those days when King Ahasuerus sat on his royal throne in Susa, the citadel, in the third year of his reign, he gave a feast for all his officials and servants. The army of Persia and Media and the nobles and governors in the provinces were before him, and while he showed the riches of his royal glory and the splendor and pomp of his greatness for many days, the story says 180 days. I need to stop first and tell you, I'm not going to say Ahasuerus anymore. If your Bible says Ahasuerus, that's great. Some of your Bibles say somebody else's name. Anybody else? Some translations say King Xerxes. King Xerxes is a whole lot easier to pronounce than Ahasuerus, so I'm going to be saying King Xerxes for the rest of the time. You want to say Ahasuerus 100 times? Yeah. Okay. Ahasuerus, his name also, King Xerxes, sometimes the Persian into Greek, and then and or Hebrew, and then into English. The transliterations can sometimes get a little difficult. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that in a little bit. But King Ahasuerus is also King Xerxes. Historical accounts about him. There's other non-biblical historical accounts about this, and unfortunately some of those we have, and some have been destroyed. I'll tell you about that in a little bit. But it's not uncommon for people to have multiple names in the different languages of that time period. So Ahasuerus, also known as Xerxes, I'm going to call him King Xerxes, and we're not going to use old historical carvings. I'm going to use a picture book because it's a whole lot more fun. Can I show you a picture book story of King Ahasuerus? King Ahasuerus was the ruler of the empire of the Medes and the Persians, which stretched over 127 provinces from Ethiopia to India. Living in his empire were many Jews. You see, in this time period, Esther's story takes place about 100 years after the Babylonian exile, when Nebuchadnezzar came over from the east and came into Jerusalem, besieged the city, destroyed the Jewish temple. He took captives, thousands and thousands of captives. He killed many of the Jews, but he also captured many and took them back into the east. The Jews that were either prominent citizens or rulers or had some type of skill, like they were craftsmen or professionals, or they were wealthy, the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar came and took them as hostages back into the east. So this is during this exile period, 100 years after the exile, and there were still many Jews living over in what you see as Susa on there, part of the Medes and the Persians that came into power after Nebuchadnezzar. That's another story for another day, but here we have Esther chapter 1, verse 10. On the seventh day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded his servants to bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal crown in order to show the people and the princes her beauty, for she was lovely to look at. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command, and at this, verse 12 says, the king became enraged and his anger burned within him. And the rest of the chapter talks about how King Xerxes was so furious that he took away the queen's title and her possessions and her estate. He just said, Queen Vashti, you're out of here. King Xerxes was historically known as a very temperamental king, and even other historians said that he made poor decisions while during his festivities when he was drunk. This guy had issues, but we're going to get into that later. Esther chapter 2, we're going to keep moving on the story here. Esther chapter 2, verse 1. After these things, when the anger of the king Xerxes had abated and he had sobered up a little bit, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what had been decreed against her. Then the king's young men who attended him said, hey, let's let beautiful young virgins be sought out for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of the kingdom to gather all the beautiful young virgins to the harem in Susa, the citadel. They'll be under the custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women. Let their cosmetics be given them, and let the young women who please the king, let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. And this pleased the king, and so he did so. Probably the first recorded beauty pageant right here in Esther chapter 2. Now there was a Jew in Susa, the citadel, whose name was Mordecai. His great-grandpa was carried away from Jerusalem under Nebuchadnezzar, and Mordecai the Jew was living here in Susa. He was among the captives carried away. And Mordecai, verse 7 says, was bringing up Hadassah. This is the Hebrew name for a young lady who was also known in Persia as Esther. Her name means star in Persian, probably pronounced Ishtar, then pronounced in English and Greek as Esther. Esther. I'm not going to call her by her Hebrew name, Hadassah, just because it's a little harder to pronounce. And the book is called Esther. So we're going to stick with Esther here for the remainder of the story. Esther. Mordecai was bringing up Esther, the daughter of his uncle, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at. And when her father and her mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So Mordecai is apparently a little older cousin of Esther, and he's taking care of her. So when the king's order, verse 8 says, when the king's order and his edict were proclaimed, and when men and young women were gathered in Susa, the citadel, Esther was also taken into the king's palace. Verse 10 says, Esther had not made known her people or kindred. She didn't tell anyone that she was Jewish. She kept that fact. Now there was people from other different places. There were Canaanites there in this Persian and Mede Empire. There was other prisoners of war and captives who had been brought into this area, but she didn't let anyone know that she was a Jewish captive, for Mordecai had commanded her not to make it known. We're going to skip down to verse 17 where the story continues, and it says, the king loved Esther more than all the women, and she won grace and favor in his sight more than all the other virgins, so that he set his royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. And the king gave a great feast for all his officials and servants, and it was Esther's feast. He also granted a remission of taxes to the provinces and gave gifts with royal generosity. Verse 21 continues the story and says, in those days, as Mordecai, Esther's cousin, was sitting at the gate, he was one of the guards, two of the king's other guards, they were eunuchs who guarded the threshold, became angry and sought to lay hands on King Xerxes. These two other guards were trying to figure out a way to have the king Xerxes assassinated. Came to the knowledge of Mordecai, he overheard them talking, so he told his cousin Esther. Esther told the king and said, hey, my cousin Mordecai, she didn't say my cousin, she just said, hey, Mordecai at the gate heard about this assassination attempt, told the king about it. Verse 23 says, when the assassination attempt was investigated and found to be so, the men were both hanged on the gallows. In Persia, it was known that they would execute prisoners usually on a stake or a pole. They would build up this high thing, and it might not have been like a gallows with a noose, but a gallows that it was a post on it, and they would impale the person to execute them, or they'd have them executed and then impale them, just to be a gruesome display of what happens if you offend the king. So here, the two men who tried to assassinate the king were both executed. It's recorded, in verse 23 says, it's recorded in the book of Chronicles in the presence of the king. This book of Chronicles might have been more like a diary, the king's diary. He would have people write things down. Here's what happened on this day. For example, we have the account, King Xerxes had a party for 180 days in which wine was drank, and he made poor decisions. This was part of his diary. Dear diary, today I was almost assassinated, so I hung those guys. Okay, this is just what's going on here. And there's another lesson in here that we might come back to later, but for today I need to keep moving. Esther chapter 3, let's keep moving here. Esther chapter 3, the story continues. It says, after these things, King Xerxes promoted Haman the Agagite. Haman might have been one of the guards that was standing nearby when the two others were executed. King Xerxes decided to promote Haman. We don't know the whole story here, but it says he was promoted. And the king advanced him and set his throne above all the officials who were with him. And all the king's servants who were at the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him. The king Xerxes said, hey, this is my assistant, Haman. When he walks by, bow down to him. But verse 2 says, Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage to him. Then the king's servants who were at the king's gate said to Mordecai, why are you not listening to the king's command? Why are you not bowing down to Haman? And when they spoke to him day after day, he would not listen to them. So they told Haman, in order to see whether Mordecai's words would stand, for he had told them, I'm not going to bow down to Haman, he's a man. I'm a Jew, I don't bow down to anybody else. Sounds like one of the 10 Commandments, doesn't it? Okay, so Mordecai said, I'm not going to be bowing down to Haman. It's not going to happen. So they went and told Mordecai, hey, Haman's not bowing down to you. He says he's a Jew. He's not going to bow down to you. When Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage to him, Haman was filled with fury. But he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone. So as they had made known to him that the people of Mordecai were Jews, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, throughout the whole kingdom. This guy has issues. One guy doesn't bow down to him. He wants to kill his whole family. Creepy stuff. Verse 7 continues, in the first month, which is the month of Nisan, they cast pur, that is, they cast lots before Haman, day after day, and they cast it month after month, until the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. This verse makes a little bit more sense at the end of the story. You'll find out in a little bit, but they were casting lots. They cast these dice, they were called pur, to decide when to make a declaration to exterminate and kill all of the Jews. They made a game out of trying to figure out when to kill Jews. That's basically what the story is. Verse 8 says, Haman said to the king Xerxes, there is a certain people scattered among and dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from those of every other people, and they do not keep the king's laws, so that it is not to be the king's profit to tolerate them. If it please the king, let it be decreed that they be destroyed. Very similar to what happened with Nebuchadnezzar, having wise men telling him, hey, let's kill Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They're Jews, they're following a different, they're not bowing down to you as a king. Yeah, so Haman tries to put this bug into King Xerxes' ear. Let's have that there's these people that are not bowing down to me as your official or to you. Verse 10 says, so the king took his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman. He also gave some money to Haman and said, you do whatever you need to do. Haman was the enemy of the Jews, and the king said to Haman, this money is given to you, the people also, to do with them as it seems good to you. So the king's scribes were summoned, and on the 13th day of the month, an edict according to all that Haman commanded was written. It was written in the name of King Xerxes and sealed with the king's signet ring. Letters were sent, verse 13 says, by couriers to all the king's provinces with instruction to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all Jews, young and old, women and children, in one day, the 13th day of the month, 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and to not only kill and annihilate and destroy them, but plunder their goods, take all of their possessions. Verse 15 says, the couriers went out hurriedly by order of the king, and a decree was issued in Susa, the citadel, and the king and Haman sat down to drink and celebrate this edict, declaration of the king, to kill all the Jews and steal their stuff. But when the letter got to Susa, the whole city was thrown into confusion. Chapter 4 continues and says, when Mordecai, who was living in Susa, learned all that had been done, Mordecai tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, went out into the midst of the city, and cried out with a loud and bitter cry, knowing that he and all the Jews would be chased down, killed, destroyed, and possessions distributed. Verse 8 says, Mordecai gave a messenger a copy of the written decree issued in Susa for their destruction, so he could show it to Esther and explain it to her, and command her to go to the king to beg his favor and plead with him on behalf of her people, the Jews. Verse 10 says, Esther spoke to the messenger and commanded him to go to Mordecai and say, all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there's but one law, to be put to death, except the one to whom the king holds out his golden scepter so that he may live. But as for me, I have not been called to come into the king these 30 days. Esther's reply back to her cousin was, I can't just go in and talk to the king. King Xerxes is known as being an extreme, kicked out Vashti. He's had other things happen, and he even has a law that if he just says you walk into his presence without being invited, you can be put to death. So Esther's like, I can't just walk in there and do this. But Mordecai, verse 13 says, Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. You're not safe in the palace. You're still a Jew, and the edict is to kill all Jews. Verse 14 says, Mordecai said, if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. Many of you, if you are familiar with the story of Esther, are familiar with this verse. You're familiar with this passage. Mordecai says, maybe God has you in the kingdom for such a time as this. But I want you to see the first part of that verse. Many times it gets skipped over, and if you're familiar with Esther's story, you might not have seen verse 14. It says, Mordecai told Esther, if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. Mordecai is saying to Esther, either God will use you, or he'll find somebody else to use. God will deliver the Jews either with your help or without you, but maybe God has you here for such a time as this. So verse 15 says, Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, go, gather all the Jews to be found in Susa, hold a fast and pray on my behalf. Do not eat and drink for 3 days, night or day. And I and my young women also will fast and pray as you do. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. Chapter 5 of the story continues at verse 1. On the third day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace in front of the king's quarters, while the king was sitting on his royal throne inside the throne room opposite the entrance to the palace. King is sitting on his throne inside of his palace, and Esther is out in the courtyard, basically, and she's like walking back and forth in front of the door, like, you think he'll call me in? You think he'll call me in? Yeah, this is what she's doing, trying to get the king's attention, waiting for him to go, come on in. Verse 2, when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, she won favor in his sight. And he held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. And Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. And the king said to her, what is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given to you, even to the half of my kingdom. This guy's a little extreme, isn't he? What do you want, Esther? I haven't seen you for a month, but hey, come on into my palace and I'll give you a half of my kingdom if you ask me for it. But she doesn't ask for half of the kingdom. Verse 4 says, Esther said, if it please the king, let the king and Haman come today to a feast that I prepared for the king. The king said, bring Haman quickly, so that we may do as Esther has asked. So the king and Haman came to the feast that Esther had prepared. And as they were eating and drinking wine after the feast, the king said to Esther, Esther, what is your wish? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Even to the half of my kingdom, it shall be fulfilled. And Esther answered and said, my wish and my request is that you'll come and have dinner with me tomorrow. Yeah, verse 8. If I found favor in the sight of the king, and if I please the king to grant my wish and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come to the feast that I will prepare for them tomorrow. And I will do as the king has said. So Haman went out that day, joyful and glad of heart. Haman's like, woohoo, I just had dinner with the king and the queen. I'm all that in a bag of chips. Yeah, I mean, he's just like all full of himself. He's a happy camper here. Verse 9 says, Haman went out that day, joyful and glad of heart. But when Haman walked out of the palace, he saw Mordecai, the Jew, in the king's gate. And Mordecai wasn't trembling in Haman's presence, and he didn't bow down in Haman's presence. And Mordecai was filled with wrath against Mordecai. Again, this dude's got some issues, right? Verse 10 says, so Haman went home, and he sent and brought his friends and his wife. And verses 11 through 13 say he boasted to them about his great wealth and his sons and the way the king honored him. And he said, I've been invited to a banquet by the king and the queen tomorrow, but I can't even be happy about it because Mordecai the Jew is sitting at the king's gate. So his wife and his friends said to him, hey, Haman, we have an idea. Why don't you build a gallows, a pole to have Mordecai killed on? And in the morning, ask the king to kill Mordecai and have him hanged on it. And then you can go to the dinner that night, and you can have an enjoyable feast. These are great friends, right? His wife and his friends and family. Hey, let's go have your enemy, Mordecai the Jew, killed. So this was their plan. Esther, yeah, let's get that picture. Esther 6, on that night the king could not sleep. And so he gave orders to bring the book of memorable deeds, the Chronicles, that they were read before the king. Read my diary to me. You know, okay, so there's nothing like reading history to put you to sleep, right? Wait, not this morning. I'm reading a history story, but you can't be sleeping. But this is what the king's like, I can't sleep, so why don't you bring the memorable deeds book to my bed and start reading it to me. Verse 2 says, and it was found how Mordecai had told about the assassination attempt. And verse 3 says, the king said, what honor or distinction has been bestowed upon Mordecai for this? The king's young men who attended him said, you didn't do anything for Mordecai. So the king said, well, who's in the court? And verse 4 says, Haman had just entered the outer court to the king's palace to speak to the king about having Mordecai hanged on the gallows that he had built for him. And the king's young men said, hey, Haman's here. He just walked in. He's standing in the courtyard. So the king said, well, let him come in. Verse 6 says, so Haman came in, and the king said to him, what should be done to the man whom the king delights to honor? King Xerxes asks Haman, what should I do to honor somebody who I'm happy with? And Haman's thinking to himself, he must be talking about me. Haman's thinking to himself, let's see, who would the king want to honor more than me? Oh, it must be me. So he comes up with this great thing. Verse 7, Haman said to the king, for the man whom the king delights to honor, let royal robes be brought, robes that the king has worn, and let them bring a horse that the king has ridden in, on whose head a royal crown is set. Let the robes and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials. Let them dress the man whom the king delights to honor. Let them lead him on the horse through the whole square of the city, proclaiming before the crowds, this is what the king does for someone who he wishes to honor. And the king says, that's a great idea, Haman. Hurry up. Go get some robes, go get a horse, just like you said, and do that for Mordecai the Jew. The same Mordecai that Haman was coming to ask permission to kill. The king says, yeah, you, Haman, you're going to be leading that horse. You're going to be dressing him. You're going to be the one proclaiming in front of everybody. This is what happens when the king is happy with somebody. So Haman took the robes and the horse, and he dressed Mordecai, led him through the square of the city, proclaiming before everybody, this is what the king does for someone he wishes to honor. What a turn of events. And a humiliating event for Haman, right? It goes on to say, after this, Mordecai returned to the king's gate, went back to his job, and kept serving the king. But Haman hurried to his house, mourning with his head covered. He was a little bit embarrassed. His family and his wife said, hey, go get permission from the king to to have Mordecai killed, and then the next minute Haman is pulling the horse around proclaiming, this man has been honored by the king. So he's a little embarrassed. He's complaining to his family and his friends. And while he's complaining, verse 14 says, while they were talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and said, Haman, hurry up. It's time for the feast that Esther has prepared. So chapter 7, verse 1 says, so the king and Haman went to the feast with Queen Esther. And on the second day, as they were drinking wine after the feast, the king again said to Esther, Queen, what is your wish? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Even half of my kingdom, it shall be fulfilled. And Queen Esther answered and said, if I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be granted me for one wish, and for my people, my one request. For we, my people, have been sold and betrayed. I, my people, we've been betrayed and sold to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. If it had just been merely being sold as slaves, I wouldn't have even bothered the king. But the king, listening to Queen Esther, said, who is this? Where is this person that wants to have your people destroyed and killed and annihilated? Who has dared to do this? And Esther said, it is a foe and an enemy. It's this wicked man right here, Haman. Then Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. And the king arose in his wrath, and he stormed out of the room and went out into the courtyard and into the palace garden. But Haman stayed to beg for his life from Queen Esther, for he saw that the king was determined to harm against him. The king returned from the palace garden to the meal where they were having this, and as he returned, Haman was falling onto the couch where Esther was, begging for his life. And we don't know if Haman tripped and fell onto the couch or if he was just there begging for his life from Esther. But whatever the case may be, he was falling onto the couch right there onto Esther as the king walked in. Bad timing. The king said, what? Now he's even assaulting the queen in my presence? In my own house? And as the word left his mouth, the king's guards came and covered Haman's face and said, prepare him for execution. One of the eunuchs in the attendants of the king, the guards, said, hey, did you know that Haman prepared an execution pole for Mordecai? The one that saved the king, the one that saved you from the assassination attempt? And the king said, oh, he's got it already prepared? Great. Hang Haman on that. And so they hang Haman on the gallows that he prepared for Mordecai. And the wrath of the king was abated. Chapter 8 continues and says, on that day King Xerxes gave to Queen Esther the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. And Mordecai came before the king. And Esther told the king how they were related, how Mordecai was a relative. And the king took off the signet ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman, gave all of Haman's possessions and estate to Mordecai. Then Esther spoke again to the king. She fell at his feet and wept and pleaded with him to avert the evil plan of Haman and the plot that he had devised against the Jews. And the king held out his golden scepter to Esther, and Esther rose and stood before the king. And she said, if it please the king, if I found favor in your sight, if the thing seems right before you, let an order be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman, which he wrote to destroy the Jews who are in the provinces of the king. She's begging for the paperwork that had been signed already and already been passed out throughout the kingdom to be revoked. And the king said, you may write as you wish with regard to the Jews in my name, and you can seal it with my signet ring. He said, you can write another decree. An edict will be written in my name and will be sealed with my ring, but I can't undo the edict that I have already sent out. He couldn't undo an edict that had already been spread out through all the kingdom, but he said, you can rewrite something that will counter it, will fix the situation. So the king's scribes, verse 9 says, the king's scribes were summoned at that time, and an edict was written according to all that Mordecai commanded concerning the Jews. Verse 10 says, The edict that he wrote in the name of King Xerxes and sealed it with the king's signet ring was sent out by mounted couriers riding the horses bred to be the fastest for the king's service. And the edict said that the king allowed the Jews who were in every city to gather and defend their lives, to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate any armed forces or people or province that might attack them, children and women included. So on one day, throughout all the provinces of King Xerxes, on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, they could defend themselves if they were attacked. So Haman's edict said, on this day, all of the Jews will be killed and attacked. You can plunder their stuff. Mordecai wrote out another one that said, Jews, you have the king's permission to defend yourself. If anybody attacks you, you can defend yourself. The castle laws we have here in the United States. Sorry, Tim, I had to say that. No, they were given permission to defend themselves. So one edict said you can attack the Jews, and the next edict couldn't undo that, but it said, Jews, you can defend yourself. If anybody attacks you, fight back to the death. This was the second edict. So that copy was spread out as a decree in every province, being publicly displayed to all the people, and the Jews were to be ready on that day to take vengeance on their enemies. If you're attacked, you fight back. Verse 16 says, the Jews had light and gladness and joy and honor, and in every province and in every city, wherever the king's command and his edict reached, there was gladness and joy among the Jews, a feast and a holiday. And many of the people of the country declared themselves Jews because people were afraid of them. It went from being afraid of telling people that you were a Jew because you might be attacked or hated, to the king said if you are attacked or hated, the Jews can fight back. Chapter 9 continues. In the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, on the 13th day of the same, when the king's command and edict were about to be carried out, on the very day when the enemies of the Jews hoped to gain the mastery over the Jews, the reverse occurred. The Jews gained mastery over those who had hated them. The Jews gathered in their cities throughout all the provinces of King Xerxes to lay hands on those who sought them harm, and no one could stand against them because they were afraid of the Jews. Verse 16 says, now the rest of the Jews who were in the king's provinces also gathered to defend their lives, and they got relief from their enemies. Verse 17 says, this was on the 13th day of the month of Adar. On the 14th day they rested and made that day of feasting and gladness. Some who were in Susa, they gathered on the 13th day and on the 14th, and they rested on the 15th day, making that a day of feasting and gladness. Therefore, the Jews of the villages who live in rural towns hold the 14th day of the month of Adar as a day for gladness and feasting, as a holiday, and as a day on which they send gifts of food to one another. Verse 19 says, Mordecai recorded these things and sent letters to all the Jews who were in the provinces of King Xerxes, both near and far, and he obliged them to keep the 14th day of the month of Adar, and also the 15th day of the same, year by year, as days on which the Jews got relief from their enemies. And as the month that they had been turned for them from sorrow into gladness, they were afraid for their lives one moment, and they were rejoicing the next. That they should make them days of feasting and gladness, days for sending gifts of food to one another and gifts to the poor, because the month had turned from sorrow into gladness and mourning into joy, or into a holiday. Verse 23 says, so the Jews accepted what they had started to do and what Mordecai had written to them. And they celebrated, even to this day. There's a tradition in the Jewish households to retell this story every year. And as they tell the story, they get to certain parts and they cheer during certain parts. And they talk about being saved and rescued, and they boo at the mention of one person's name, Haman. So as I reiterate the Cliff Notes version, the summary that we have here in chapter 9, starting at verse 24, as I reiterate this, when you hear Haman's name, you can boo. He's a bad guy. When you hear Mordecai's name or Esther's name, you can cheer. Woohoo! Ready? So the Jews accepted what they had started to do, what Mordecai and Esther had written them to do. Woohoo! Good. For Haman, the enemy of all the Jews, had plotted against the Jews to destroy them. And he had cast pur, that is, he cast lots or dice, to decide on how and when to crush and to destroy them. But when it came before the king, and in Jewish tradition they would dress up and give somebody a crown to be the king, he gave orders in writing that his evil plan that had been devised against the Jews should return on his own head. So they called these days, days of Purim, after the term Pur. Therefore, because of what was written in this letter, and of what they had faced in this matter, and what had happened to them, because of Mordecai and Esther saving the Jews, and what Haman had tried to do, the enemy of the Jews firmly obligated themselves and their offspring, and all who joined them, that without fail they would keep those 2 days according to what was written, and at that time appointed every year, that these days should be remembered and kept throughout every generation, in every clan, province, and city, and that these days of Purim should never fall into disuse among the Jews, nor should the commemoration of these days cease among their descendants. Before I give you a little bit more information, there's just 2 more verses I want to read for you in Esther chapter 10 to wrap up the story. And all the acts of Xerxes' power and might, and the full account of his high honor of Mordecai, to which the king advanced him, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of the Media and Persia? And again, unfortunately, many of these historical books were lost when new kings came into power, trying to destroy the history of previous rulers. But there are still some historical accounts, and including the story we have in Esther. Mordecai the Jew was second in rank to King Xerxes, and he was great among the Jews and popular with the multitude of his brothers, for he sought the welfare of his people and spoke peace to all his people. This story of Esther and this reminder of the festival of Purim is important. Again, some of you maybe have heard this story for the first time, and maybe some of you have heard the story, are familiar with it, and maybe you're reminded of some of the lessons, but I wanted to retell the story today, because this coming Thursday is the 13th of Adar. This week is the festival of Purim for the Jews. This is a special time that Jews celebrate, where they remember there was a king who tried to have us killed, annihilated, exterminated, destroyed. There was evil plotted against us, but God provided a way. And for thousands of years, the Jews still are celebrating Purim. It's a special festival. This Thursday is the 13th, and they will be fasting on Thursday, just like we have written in the book of Esther. And on Friday and Saturday, it's a celebration. There's feasting, there's parties, there's kids getting dressed up and acting out the story of Esther and King Xerxes and Mordecai and Haman. They have a feast, and they give gifts to one another. They dress up in costumes, and they have it's almost like Halloween and Christmas mixed together as a Jewish holiday. It's an interesting holiday for the Jews to celebrate the feast of Purim. They get to eat little cakes. I was trying to get some for church service this morning. They're little Jewish dessert cakes. They're in the shape of a triangle, and they have this little fruit. It's a pastry with fruit and or nuts in it. And they're called Hamantash. It's Haman, Tosh. It's either Haman's head covering. When they said, "You're done," they covered his head. Some people think it means Haman's hat. It's this funny little pastry, but it's a way of the Jews saying, Haman was destroyed. And it gives us joy, because it tastes good. I wanted to get you some of those this morning. It didn't work out. Maybe after the Jews celebrate Purim, there'll be some leftover. You can go to, I think Hy-Vee or Cub might even have Hamantash for Purim, if you want to try it. But it's part of the retelling of the story. It's a celebration to remember what Esther and Mordecai did, and booing at the enemies of the Jews, and helping children remember and learn this whole story of Queen Esther and Mordecai. How God saves the Jewish people from destruction under the Persian Empire. For us, though, the Jewish history and this story is still important. We aren't going to be having a fast or festival as a church family, but you can still fast and pray, because there's still some people out there that want to destroy not only the Jewish nation, but the Christians. There are people that are still out to destroy the Christian faith and the Jews. It would be a good idea to fast and pray for God's deliverance, and then have a feast afterwards, right? Because we can celebrate. We can be reminded, as we did this morning in our praise offering, God is all-powerful. God is in control. God is awesome. God does great things. God is loving and kind and merciful and forgiving. And God still rescues. Our part of the Purim story, and there's an interesting parallel to it, we've been saved from an enemy who wanted our destruction, who wants to steal, kill, and destroy. He doesn't go by the name of Haman. He goes by the name of Satan, devil, the adversary. We had an enemy who wanted to destroy us, but we had a Savior come along who rescued us and redeemed us and purchased our freedom and gives us, or turns our story from sorrow into gladness, turns our story from mourning into joy, because we've been rescued and saved. So our Purim story is similar to what the Jews celebrate. It's just a little different because of what Jesus has done for us. You might have recognized that phrase. He's turned our sorrow into gladness and our mourning into joy. Do you recognize that phrase? See, the prophet Isaiah wanted the Jews to be encouraged and reminded that someday they would be freed from their bondage and exile in Babylon. And in Isaiah wrote this: "Therefore the redeemed of the Lord shall return and come with singing unto Zion. And they will obtain gladness and joy, and sorrow and mourning will flee away." That's not just a picture of the Jews, that's a picture of us because of what Jesus has done for us. And so we even sing that chorus sometimes. You might be familiar with, "Therefore the redeemed of the Lord shall return, and come with singing unto Zion, and everlasting joy will be upon their heads. They shall obtain gladness and joy, and sorrow and mourning shall flee away. Therefore the redeemed of the Lord shall return, and come with singing unto Zion, and everlasting joy will be upon their head." This week's Purim, there's Jews celebrating and retelling this story. As Christians, it's our job to retell our story. We've been saved, we've been rescued, we've been delivered, and we need to keep passing that on, sharing that joy with others. And can I encourage you, Thursday, maybe a day of fasting and prayer for our country and our deliverance, as we're still looking to be rescued and delivered from the persecution of our adversary. Well, I want to wrap up with one more thing. Next week, I want to tell you a little bit more about Esther's story. Today, I just kind of had to race through it and tell you the whole story so you can know what Purim's about for this week. Next week, I want to dig into it a little bit more and tell you a little bit about some of the parallels in it, because there's more to Esther's story. Esther is Persian for star. Persia was in the east, for example. There were wise men in the east that followed in Ishtar, or in Esther, or they followed a star looking for the deliverer. There's all sorts of parallels, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that next week, the rest of Esther's story.